Hey, it's not showing up.
Nah, we got further than that.
Hey guys, we're back. Tim and I are currently arguing about how far we got in 1 Corinthians. We got about halfway through 7 because we got derailed by, and I didn't tell Tim this, I had a work meeting right up until podcast time, so we really didn't have a chance to do show notes. But we're going to get hijacked again. And it's partly because it's just timely. We're having this robust discussion before we get on air about experience versus generational gaps and things like that. And it's actually been a really good discussion. But
Okay, if we're at the end of 7, we're at the end of 7.
I believe you. He doesn't believe me. But I'm just telling you, we're not going to dig into in like an exegetical line by line today necessarily. We touched on what I want to jump into today and really drive it home. We touched on this last week. But I really want to drive it home because I've had multiple conversations in the last 7 days that have come down to this. Sean made an interesting point too a while ago. It's not just a biblical truth. It's
a life truth.
It's a life truth. Here's what Tim and I talk about all the time. And people, when we say things that like I'm about to say, they look at us like, what is that? And we talk about eternal verses, eternal scriptures.
Right.
Well, the narrow mind would say, well, all scriptures are eternal. They're God's breathed word, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but when we teach people how to study, when we get to the application phase, we use a method that uses an acronym, SPACE. Are there sins to avoid, promises to claim, actions or attitudes to emulate, commands to obey, or examples to follow? But then we add this one, and we add this T. We call it space tea. I'm going to make a slide one day. It's called a cup of tea, space tea. Anyway, I digress. But are there truths in the passage that I need to accept?
Yeah.
And I made some show notes, and the reason I like 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7, as we touched on this last week. Tim, you can jump in, then I'll get down here later. But it is a great, great chapter for driving home the point that you cannot approach the scriptures as merely and only a rule book or an instruction manual for life. It does have rules in it. It does have boundaries in it, but there's so much more in it. For example, we use 2 Chronicles 16:9 all the time as an eternal verse. If you read 2 Chronicles 16:9, you want to quote it? The eyes of the Lord.
For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in the behalf of those whose hearts are perfect toward him.
Now, when you open up the context of 2 Chronicles 16, fore and aft, even in 15 and 17, there's some bad junk happening in there. There is a story that's being told about a specific people at a specific place in history with specific circumstances. If you approach the scriptures as merely and only face value, list of rules and regulations and whatnot, you'll learn about this story. Oh, that's good. That's a great story. I learned about some historic underpinnings of scripture. But it's more than that. It is a story about those people. But when we talk about eternal verses, there's truths in there that transcend the context that they're found
of that
in.
Situation. Yeah, so in that story, and we pull this verse out of it, and when we're talking about this verse to other people, we tell them we're kind of jerking this thing right out of the middle of a conversation and a situation to apply it all over the place. But if you just had that story and that's all you had and you read through it, you would hit that part and you would say, basically, God is the parent. He's going, you know what? You were doing okay, and then you did something stupid and you knew better, and now you're going to get spanked. And that's all you'd take out of that.
Well, and if you only approach it that way, you then apply it to your life of, I better make sure I do everything right or I'm going to get a spanking.
Yeah.
and you become a legalist, and it turns into this weird stuff that God did not intend necessarily.
Yeah.
Does he want us to be careful about living in holiness? Absolutely. But when we pull that out of there and using even our method, what is the eternal truth? The eternal truth is that God, the creator of the universe, looks around the whole earth for hearts that are perfect towards him. And it's kind of stuck in this middle of this story. But regardless of whether or not this people at this time in history in this event were obedient or disobedient or were getting punished or not, the truth that transcends that is that God's eyes roam the earth. That's
All the time.
all the time. It whether you can take that verse and apply it to when Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, God's eyes are still roaming the whole earth to look for those hearts that are perfect toward him.
And he's using Paul at that particular time to equip people to be able to, not by rule and regulation, but by giving them the ability, I'll say, to think.
Yes.
That's really probably a bad way to say it.
No, that's good.
Well, it is a truth.
It gives them the right framework to see things.
And you may still be going, but wait a minute, I need to know, and you may not even know you're saying this. Just give me the parameters.
Tell me what I'm supposed to do.
And so that's why it's hard to, well, maybe kind of, and I know where you're going with this. So let me
Are you sure?
let me put a little context on top of all this. So remember now, we're in 1 Corinthians, and he first gets into it, and he's just chastising them to no end. From a perspective of, you're a bunch of stupid idiots and you can't get it. That's not what he's doing. What he's saying is I know that you have the capacity because I've been watching, but you refuse to take it. And it's Paul and Apollos, that's the stupidest argument that you could ever have. And
Yeah.
so he's really kind of backhanding them, if you want to call it that. That's not really what it's more of a exhortation would be the right word to use. And then when we get to chapter 7, it's like he's done ranting, and he goes, okay, now let's talk about the stuff you sent me to ask about.
Yeah.
And that's what we're in the middle of right now.
But
and chapter 8 keeps on with that. So keep going.
But even in the middle of him saying, now let's talk about the specifics of the questions you asked, he peppers it with these things that we talked about this last week, but I like I said, I wanted to drive it home. He peppers us with these statements that if we're only approaching, and I'm using that very specifically because the tendency is for people to say, oh, this is not a rule book, I don't really have to follow it.
Right.
That's not what we're saying. I'm saying if it's only a rule book.
I think he was kind of shaking him up with that too.
He was. But he peppers the writing with, oh, this is not of the Lord, this is my opinion. And then in other times he says, this is not my opinion, this is actually of the Lord.
And he also says later down in there that is, I give you this rule.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you an
To
example.
the churches.
I'm going to give you two examples. Another example of eternal stuff. And the story we love to share all the time, we use it every time we talk, is the story of Elisha and Gehazi. They're surrounded by the armies. Elisha's like, chill. Gehazi's freaking out. Elisha prays, Lord, open his eyes. Lord opens his eyes, and he sees all the chariots and all the angels surround. There's more with us than there are with them. We're good, Gehazi, no problem. Well, what's the eternal? If you just approach the scriptures at context only, it's real easy to go, well, that was good for them. But what does that do for me? The transcendent eternal truth is that there are angelic beings that exist. They apparently drive flaming chariots at our protection. There is a realm out there that we can't see with the human naked eye. It takes divine intervention to see it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so there's a truth to glean out of that there's hope and confidence to be placed even in the darkest of situations in the fact that there are parts to this existence that we can't even see or comprehend in our human eyes.
And I'm going to use the term experiencing God. I'm not talking about Henry Blackaby stuff. And if you don't know who that is, don't worry about it. When Gehazi saw that, we don't really get any narrative that he was like, oh, I see. I think he was having to process. He accepted, I think, probably what he saw, but we don't get to see all that because what happens next is Elisha, is going, he walks out and talks to the enemy, so to speak. And I think Gehazi is seeing something of the kingdom, the truth of what it is, and it kind of,
It rattled him.
it's rattling him up. And he said, well, where do you get all that from, Tim? Because as I've watched people that encounter God in various places, it kind of rings their bell, so to speak, where you're just, and you don't really know what to do with that. But I would tell you that's divine intervention when you needed to see it, whether you agreed with it or not. Because I know that I've encountered God in some places when I saw what was really happening, and I had to soak on it for years before I could really pull the, what does that look like and what does that mean? But that doesn't mean I wasn't ready to see it.
But you still, that's why Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling.
And it also, God works out all things for the good of those that love him and are called to
According
his purposes.
Yeah.
And intellectually we go like, oh, okay, well, that's, he tells me what to do and I do it. Much deeper than that. And that's what we're dealing with in this and Paul's conversation. And I think he's in a tension in this because he knows that they're probably not all going to get it again. And there's probably going to be more conversations like he did in the first 6 verses later on.
Yeah.
But he's willing to deal with that.
And as he's peppering it with these, this is God, this is me, whatever, part of me wants to go, that was intentional. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just the Spirit saying, I want you to write this in such a way, because what it did was it forced them to work through it on their own with their maturity, with their Holy Spirit empowerment, with their mind that God gave them, with their own study background. It made them do it. At the same time, he's telling them in chapter 11, he's going to tell them in verse 1, imitate me as I follow Christ. He's like, there's a both and here that he's exhorting them to. When you don't know what you're doing, imitate me. At the same time, while you're imitating me, work out this junk with your own intelligence. Be a Berean, challenge the scriptures, or with the scriptures, challenge what you're hearing, work it out. But in that process, while you're walking through this process, imitate what I'm doing. I'm following Jesus. And so there's this tension and balance at the same time of this both and. It's like the already not yet. Jesus, the kingdom is here now already, but there's a not yet component to it that's coming. He's in both places. We're not.
And this may sound like it's getting deep and complex, but it's really not. Something else that we like to talk about a lot, or that something that I came across a long time ago was in, I think it's in Matthew chapter 3, where John the Baptist is letting the whoever's have it. And he said that Jesus is standing there with his winnowing fork in his hand. And the big context of what that means is that those of us that have been saved specifically, and I would even tell you people that are not saved but are probably going to be, he's taking us in that context. There's wheat, grain being ground, not into powder, but getting rid of the external husks so that the grain can actually be used. This is a real farming process, right? And they still do it in the Middle East. So they take that grain and they throw it on a really hard place, whether it was built or it was natural, and they roll over a really heavy stone over this stuff and crack it. And Jesus standing there with his winnowing fork in his hand is just the picture of once that stone cracks, and everything that we're talking about, what seems uncertainty and working through this, and what does that look like, and I do it wrong or I don't do it wrong. And who is God in all of this kind of stuff? He's the one orchestrating this stuff. And because we think if we're in good graces, none of these pressure things are going to happen.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite. And Jesus is sticking his winnowing fork underneath you after you've been crushed by circumstance or life. And when you think you're done, it throws you straight up in the freaking air and down you come again for another round. You think, well, God doesn't love me for that. No.
That's how you know he does love you.
That's how, and that's, I know that from a humanistic point of view, that doesn't work. But again, we're talking about eternal truths.
Yeah.
and the eternal way that it's done. And some people even simply might say, well, we have to go through that because we're in a sinful place.
Maybe.
I don't think so. I think even if the fall hadn't happened, there would still be struggles and confrontations with God, not in a sinful manner.
Well,
but he created us that way.
That's why a good example is Moses. Nobody got to talk to God like Moses did.
Yeah.
Scriptures even declare to all the prophets, even these prophets that were making it stop rain, that were doing, even these Elijah and Elisha and Enoch and all these guys, he says, I speak to them in riddles. I give them hard sayings, shadowy sayings, and they got to figure it out by seeking my face. He goes, but you, Moses, Moses and I get to talk like a friend. Like we're going to sit and talk. Even in that special relationship, which we see at the Mount of Transfiguration, he shows up again, and Jesus is in his glorified form, so is Moses, and they're chatting. Even in that relationship, Moses is grinding against what the Lord wants to do when they're down there making the calf at the bottom of the mountain.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, God says, I'm going to destroy all of them. He's like, you can't do that. Now, that's just grind. When we talk about...
Well, and it was the other way around, too. There were places where Moses is going, I'm done with this. And God's going, oh, no, you're not.
Exactly. And exactly right. We even see that same sort of a thing with Jesus, with his disciples. How long? What do I have to tell you? You see that frustration in his humanity, but what does he do as a response? He goes and he prays and he seeks the Father. So when we talk about scriptures talk about, but we talk about the scriptures that talk about, and you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Hebrews and other places, that there's this tempest and this turmoil that surrounds the Lord. The human mind immediately wants to go, well, that's not really true, because we think of tempest and turmoil as chaos and uncontrolled and no form and no point or purpose or negative. It's always negative.
Yeah.
Like he's tearing things up.
And to us,
it feels
that's
that
how
way.
we see it. But from his perspective,
it's very different.
It's working out to an end that actually works.
And so, but what that breeds in us is the ability to stare in God's face in our circumstances, as the wheel of trial and of struggle and sanctification crushes us, and as Jesus with his winnowing fork throws us in the air, it's tempestuous.
Yes.
And it's hard. But out of that comes the ability to work through stuff as it's presented to us with the intellect he gave us, with the spiritual gifts that he gave us, with the empowerment of the Holy Spirit that he gave us, through studying the scriptures that he gave us. All of this works together to give us discernment. Elisha had not only the vision of the angelic beings, but he had the experience of having relied on God in other times. So he put the experience with the ability to see, and it gave him rest, because he knew whatever turmoil it looked like out there, there's more to the story.
And he wasn't born understanding that.
No.
We don't get to see Elisha coming up into who he was, but I guarantee you he went through it too.
And so as Gehazi comes out and the scales come off his eyes, as it were, and he sees, now he's got half the equation. He's got the ability to see, but he yet lacks the experience to walk in what he sees. So though he's I promise you, he's still going, yeah, I see it. I see what you're telling me, but I still don't know how this is going to help me.
I don't know what to do with it.
I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And while he figures that out and goes through the experience of whatever that's going to mean, and there's a story behind all that, he has to trust Elisha, who has both sets of the equation, and knows that, hey, we're going to walk through this. Jesus did the same thing. But for the joy that laid before him, he endured the cross. The disciples could not put it into their brains why he would do this.
Yeah.
The Roman soldiers didn't understand. Why don't you call down the angels if you're Jesus? Because if you're really God, if you're really him, then because they couldn't understand what was really happening, but Jesus could. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for me, let me give you an example of what happened. I did this week. I went on ChatGPT, on the AI deal. I went on Google, and I asked the question, what is 1 Corinthians about? Just what is it about? And I went to probably 15 different, Bible interpretation websites, really trustworthy ones. All of them, except one, and I don't even remember which one it was. Their basic summary of 1 Corinthians was, it's a collection of things to do and not to do in the church. Okay? And these are good, respectable theologians. Okay? Yeah. Only one agreed with, they said that it is a good place to go to find out what to do with certain things in the church, how to do corporate worship. But then they had this paragraph that said, but more than that, it is a story about walking in maturity.
Yes. I
couldn't believe and I wasn't looking for somebody just to agree with our take on 1 Corinthians. Yeah. I was actually shocked that only one of the places where people typically would go to glean I don't know what this verse means, I'm going to go look it up, were saying, what they were saying wasn't false. It wasn't heresy. It's true.
True. It's only true to a given level.
Right. But the point of the way that he's presenting these truths in the first 6, he uses the statements all the time. We see the writer of Hebrews doing the same thing in, what is it, chapter 6, he said, or is it 12? Maybe 12, I forget. We're going to leave, 6 or 8. We're going to leave the elemental things and move on to maturity. Yeah. He does the same thing in 1 Corinthians. He's putting this stuff out, and the way that he's doing it, he goes like, this is my opinion. I command you to do this, but it's not the Lord. You go work it out.
Yeah.
It's better if you stay single, but it's not wrong if you get married. And if you're always looking for, you got to tell me what to do all the time, he just blows your mind in that point.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people that just innately are just, I'm 58 years old. And you know what? I'm tired of doing a whole lot of things. I don't want to have to make decisions anymore. And I don't want to,
right.
When all these variations of things come up and I have to weave in between, not just for my own sake or other people's sakes or whatever, I don't want to.
Right. But you have to.
God didn't ask me that.
Exactly.
And he's given me the capacity to do that, or to counsel people on what to do, or whatever. But that same feeling happens when you have less experience, but probably you're more like, which one do I do? Like, which job do I do? Yeah. And I'm going to sin if I do one, or whatever. That may be the scenario that God's put you in to make you have to work that out.
Well, and I have 3 very specific examples to illustrate this, and 2 of them are with my own life. First one is, early on, I was talking with Sean about this, early on in my walk, when I first took my first church, I went to that place with a set of instructions, as it were, theological moorings that had been taught to me over the years, partly through my parents, partly through the church we were in, or just the culture I was running in. And I got out there with nobody. I had a Bible and a Strong's Concordance and a Vine's Dictionary. Boop, that's it. No internet, no computers, no nothing. And I had to start, I would come across this thing or that thing that the scriptures did not support exactly the way that I had internalized it. I'm not going to say that the way I was taught it.
Yeah.
Because I also found later that some of the ways I internalized the things were not the way it was intended to be taught to me.
Yes.
And so I had
to take
that.
That's a learned thing.
That's a learned thing. So I remember coming back to Mom. I tell this story all the time and saying, Mom, I got to throw out everything you ever taught me. It's a really silly way to handle it. But fundamentally, I was like, what I meant was, I got to challenge everything that you've told me. I hear that even echoing in our conversation today.
Oh yeah.
Before we get on, no props included. But because I've lived it and I get it. The part I was lacking was I needed to stick with it until I could figure it out and learn it. And experience shows me throwing the baby out with the bathwater is bad, because then you got to fill it with something else and it's going to be bad. And so that has been helpful. It's like in my work environment, not just when I'm at now, but in other, like when we worked at Vantone, there are those individuals who say, I don't want to think about the big picture. I just want instructions. When we worked at a flavor company, they're like, I just want to fill bottles. I just want to batch. I don't care about the ramifications of the sales or the cost. You tell me what to do, whatever. And there's a place for that in the work environment. People, though, approach their faith like that. I don't want to think about anything. I just want you to tell me what to do. That breeds legalism. It leads narrow thinking.
Well, that's intellectual laziness that I talked about last week. That's what that is.
That's why Peter would tell us, add to your faith knowledge and to your,
And it's astounding that guy said that.
Yes, exactly. Because that's a whole different
other conversation, but that means something.
And so, the other situation that I would give as an example of this tempestuous working out, winnowing fork, using your intellect and the scriptures he doesn't always tell you go left or go right. Sometimes he says you need to decide based on the leading of the Holy Spirit. And maybe he's really saying, I just need you to follow me. So you need to learn to listen to me and worry less about making a decision and worry more about what am I doing? And you just follow me. With Brenna, it's been she turned 16 this last Wednesday, which is a miracle in and of itself.
Cool.
And so early on, we're begging God daily, please heal her, please heal her. And there were occasions where he would. Like she had a kidney tumor pre-birth in utero, and it was a real concern. And man, we prayed over that thing. Literally a couple of weeks later, when they do the scans and stuff, the sucker's gone. It wasn't, it was just one, you put them side by side, big white blip on one, nothing on the other, kind of a deal. But there's also times where things didn't get healed.
Yeah.
And they even cascaded worse. You fast forward through seasons where we go through, Lord, why are we going through all of this? Can we get a break? Can we just get some respite? And then you get towards the back end of it and you still have those moments, but it's taken 16 years to really appreciate what it is he's doing.
Yeah.
Or let me rephrase that, to begin to get a glimpse of what he's doing.
You get a glimpse that actually something is doing.
And that's just it. And that was, you took the words out of my mouth.
That's right eternally.
Yes.
That's we're built to take comfort in eternal things.
Right. And it's, if I only look at the surface of the circumstances, we're going to use that as the example of people looking at the scriptures. If I only look at the circumstances and I don't see and don't have faith in, according to 2 Corinthians 14, the things that I can't see, and I focus on only the things that I can see, I'm going to be in depression because all the stuff I can see sucks. And it does. But when I came to the realization that she's going to lead more people to Christ with no words than I could ever lead to him with my words, it began to make sense. Well, I won't even say it made sense. There's a peace that comes in that I don't have to trust my circumstances. I can trust what he's doing because I know that he's doing something. In 1 Corinthians 7, he's doing some of the similar things. He's pushing on. When we went to Nicaragua, Tim and Ben, the guys that we went with, they would pick somebody when we would stop at a place, and you never knew who it was going to be, to give their testimony. He'd grab them by the back and shove them out into the front of the deal and hand them a bullhorn. There's 300 people in the street, and they would go, give your testimony.
That's great training.
And people would turn around when their eyes are big. What in the heck just happened? And you just have to do it without exception. When that was over, the person who did that was like, I've never experienced anything like that. That was amazing.
Yeah, it's powerful.
I could feel the Holy Spirit. The Lord was working through. Oh my goodness. People were getting, and they were stumbling. I love Jesus. And people would come up and weeping and want to give their lives to the Lord. And it was they're like throngs of people would get saved. And it was just, and the Lord's laughing, going like, it's not about you. And when you do that a time or two, you learn to trust not even the process. You learn to trust him. That's how Romans 8:28 can even be true. a very narrow view of that, and people, there's a dispensational group out there, some of them, that view that as God's a reactive God, that you can screw up and then he'll just fix your screw up and make it okay. Well, God's not a reactive God.
No.
What we view a lot of times as the world's exploding is really just him getting us to a place where we need to be. It's him rolling the stone over us. It's him throwing us up in the air. Well, and sometimes we sin and screw up and we bring some pain on ourselves that he would not have had for us. But he can also take that and turn it. How many times, Tim, have you heard somebody go through an awful time? I know a guy particularly, awful addiction, like heroin addiction, got clean, got sober. Now he's a preacher. And he will give his testimony. He's like, I would never know the peace and the joy of the Lord had I not gone through being a junkie.
Yeah. For us, it's hindsight.
Yes. But it's also not correct to say, oh, so God wanted him to go be a junkie so that he could have. No, it's not that either. God would love for him to have avoided being a junkie, and he would have done something different with him. But because the guy chose that, God used that.
Well, and the experiential thing, so we're talking about a lot of things between God and an individual and the pain that they're enduring, if you want to call it pain. But the experienced people, so to speak, so like Elisha and Paul, sometimes I can watch what somebody's going through and I can tell. I might not be able to say, oh, well, God orchestrated this situation so that you'd have to work through X, Y, Z. But on the same token, I can see what's transpiring there and that it is eternal.
Yeah.
And they can't see that. And they argue their points, right, left, up, down, all that stuff. And I find myself in a place to just stay the course.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's what Paul is doing right here, I think, because I see his attitude completely switching.
Yeah.
And he's saying these things. This is my opinion. This one is of the Lord specifically. And this one is something I direct you guys to do because I'm wiser and been through some things, and God has been able to give me this vision.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. And I'm sure a lot of them were sitting there after they'd just been chastised to no extent, and they're in this rattled condition of sorts. And some of them are going, you can't tell me what to do. And some of them are going, I don't know what happened here, but you know what? I want to be able to see like he does, or what I think he does. And maybe that response is just maybe they even might dress like Paul. You know? I don't know. The goofiest things can happen, but none of those responses are wrong.
Right. It's all part of the process.
But in our linear way of dealing with things, and I think that that's part of the struggle that God knows that we go through, and it doesn't limit him.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people fuss over the thing that I have to see it the way God does, or it's not going to make any sense, and I'm not going to know what to do. Well, if you spend any time in the scriptures and start studying scriptural history, you'll see that everybody under the planet went through that exact same thing, but one trusted and obeyed and walked.
Yeah.
And one didn't.
Yeah.
And that still doesn't mean that God's not going to work things out and make it. Do you love the Lord? Is he in your heart? Do you desire that? Even when you're going, I can't make the step because I just don't know what to do.
Right.
That doesn't.
Well, in our culture,
that has no effect on him eternally at all.
Our culture has lived under this lie that you can have all the information you need to succeed. Because like, well, what do I need to know? I Google it. I can do it. You know, if you just have the right formula, you can be a day trader and make millions. If you just have the right formula, you can be this or you can do that, you know, and it may or may not work for you. And you know, the formula, people approach their faith like that, very formulaic. And if you're one of those people that only sees the scripture as a formula, if I do everything that's right, I'll get God blessings. If I don't do the stuff I'm not supposed to, I'll avoid his wrath. If that's the extent of it, you're going to get the passages like 1 Corinthians 7 where he says, this is not a command of the Lord, but it's in the scriptures that you believe are of the Lord. And you're going to go and not know what to do. And then you're going to make up these weird theologies like, well, Paul just didn't realize how inspired he was.
Yeah.
Give me a break. If anybody knew how the Spirit was to move, it was the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
Okay? Outside of Jesus, he's the guy. And so I'm just like, even if I were to give the caveat, I were to, for the sake of argument, and say, okay, fine, that I'll give you that. That still doesn't solve the problem.
Yes.
And the problem is we've got to work through stuff.
Well, not even spin that around a little bit. So if you get into that condition, maybe that's how you're built. To
Fair
some
enough.
degree, you're built that
Fair
way.
enough.
God has just put you in a position that only you and him can work it out.
Exactly.
There ain't a person on the planet that can tell you how to walk through it. That's where you have to walk by faith, and he has put you in a place where you're going to walk by faith or you're going to crater. And even then, if your heart is perfect toward the Lord, no matter how bad you've cratered, no matter how much you've walked away, if your heart's perfect toward the Lord, he's not left you.
Right.
It seems like it, it feels like it, and people may tell you, well, God doesn't going to bless you.
It's a pile. It's just a pile.
It is a pile.
Well, and it's like,
That's his omnipresence. That's the completeness of who he is over every situation, every place, and everything. And that's why Paul can go, well, this one's of the Lord. This is kind of my opinion of this kind of things, because he knows that
when he has faith in his opinion.
Yes.
Because
Well, he has faith in God that he can give an opinion, and even if he's wrong, he's going to correct that and make it right.
right. And he has said in other places, he says, I have the mind of Christ.
Yeah.
And he's pursuing the Lord, and he's like Jacob. We got to land the plane. But Sean's giving me the land the plane symbol.
I hope this hadn't been weird sounding or anything, but
I always want to say, what's the one thing I want people that see this to take away? That whether it was intentional or not, I grew up in a culture where my granddad used to say, I believe this book, cover to cover, pillar to post. If it's in there, I believe it. And I remember one time sitting, and I said, oh, so you're going to stone your kids for talking back? That was inappropriate and disrespectful, just in case you're wondering, to say it like that. But
I would tell you it's a righteous question.
But it is a righteous question. And I understood the meaning, I think his heart in that was perfect towards the Lord.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he missed the point of, but you're going to have to work through some stuff.
Yes.
Of how we apply this stuff to our lives. And the only way to do that, the only way to make sense of this thing, is to seek God's face, you and him. That's it. Now, do you use people around you and fellowship, and do you get to stand on the shoulders of 2,000 years of scholarship and spiritual fathers like Paul? Yes, you do. But ultimately, what 1 Corinthians 7 drives home for me is even in the Hebrews 11, because we have such a great, or it says in 12 about 11, because we have such a great cloud of witnesses. Here's all this stuff.
Yeah.
By faith they did this, and we're encouraged to emulate them. Even with all of that, you still got to stare God in the face.
Yeah.
To grab a hold of him and saying, I'm not letting go until you make sense of this, and it may take a lifetime.
Yeah.
Don't give up.
Don't give up, and have patience with yourself.
Yes.
You don't have to know the things that we know. Just spend time learning these things, even if it is academic up front.
Well, and there's people that we spend time with that have been through lots of things we haven't been through.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a Paul, everybody's got a Timothy, everybody's got somebody that iron sharpens iron and all that stuff. And so it's an eternal journey of learning. And it's learning about who God is, because who he is will inform how you interpret what he says to do.
Yeah.
And if you don't know who he is, it just becomes rules, regulations, legalism, and it becomes weird, and it's not productive. That's it. Man, I'm sorry I was passionate today, maybe more so than I ought to be. But I just want to encourage people to stare into God's face. And the words that come to my mind is, I said, I don't want you just to take the scriptures at face value. Their face value is eternally beneficial.
Yeah.
But he's got so much more in there. Go past the surface, Do a 1 Corinthians 14. Go into the reality, Hebrews. Past the good stuff that's just the shadow of the reality, and see what you can learn about God himself through what you read and experience.
Yeah.
Love you guys. See y'all next week. Hopefully, Lord willing. Bye. I gave you like 0 indication.